President Cyril Ramaphosa will take center stage when he delivers the State of the Nation address on Thursday. It will be the president's first SONA as head of government of national unity. Now, Ramaphosa is expected to reflect on South Africa's achievements over the past year, but also to take the nation into his confidence on government's plans for the year ahead. Now, the country is currently faced with challenges of unemployment, crime, social development, and of course, a sluggish economy. And to expand on how SONA will impact the political landscape moving forward, we joined virtually now by Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko. Ms. Pheko, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you so much.
So, looking at this year's SONA, this, of course, taking place against the backdrop of a government of national unity, do you expect it to be different from what we've become accustomed to?
So I think the SONA always is, as you mentioned, is always a way of the state and the president, as you say, taking us into his confidence and trying to give him a sense of the roadmap for where we're going over the next 12 months specifically. It is the quintessential family meeting. I think in the context of GNU, or GNU, as it's colloquially called, there have been quite a few very important wrestlings and contradictions within this formation, particularly because it really straddles the ideological parameters from the far left to the far right. So there are those who, of course, think that will always feel as though the ANC, as the center, as the prefect of the GNU, has gone too far, and those who will feel that it hasn't gone far enough. And I think what President Ramaphosa is going to try to do is to stamp his authority as the prefect in chief of the GNU. And we've seen this happening, of course, with the recent flurry of legislation, interesting legislation that we're going to discuss, of course, that has been passed in recent weeks and months, which have often gone in opposition to some of the key GNU partners, specifically and particularly parties like the Freedom Front Plus, the Democratic Alliance as well. So it will probably be a statement of not only intent of the ANC, but an intent of unity, whether or not all unity partners are on board.
So speaking of the partners of the GNU, this time around, you have more leaders from different parties. I mean, there have traditionally been leaders of other parties who were given ministerial positions. But this time around, with more leaders from different parties making up cabinet, is there perhaps a threat of the president's thunder being stolen ahead of this family meeting, given that these leaders could very well go and report back to their parties, their constituencies within their party before the president delivers that State of the Nation address, and it may get to us before the president tells us?
Yeah, but I think, Skinner, the question then is it party first or is it government first? So if you're in a government of national unity, that actually essentially means that you have subverted your party political loyalties and your party political, not so much priorities and ideations, but certainly the modalities of then going to your party before the president has pronounced. The president, who is the president of the coalition that you have agreed to be part of, would be incredibly problematic and messy at best.
So we wait to see how that's going to play out and whether some of these leaders will actually do that and how it plays out. But of course, just getting to some of the nitty-gritties of this State of the Nation address and some of the niggles within the GNU. The Democratic Alliance, for example, has long resisted the expropriation of land without compensation, a position echoed by the US President now, Donald Trump. Would it be wise for the president to perhaps rein in the GNU's opposition partners, especially in the DA, to accept, some of these bills and acts that they are not necessarily in agreement with? If you look at the Expropriation Act, you look at the Bella Act, you look at the National Health Insurance Bill, those sort of things. How does he navigate this going into the SONA?
Let's talk about the Land Expropriation Act first, because there's nothing to rein in, Sakina. In 1994, there was already a consensus that there was, there needed to be some form of a redistributive land redistribution system. And this has been embodied and canonized inside several documents, inside several, existing pieces of legislation. Many people over the last few days have been referencing the 1975 expropriation, land expropriation legislation, which I think is slightly problematic because, of course, that would have been a regime that was not our own regime. But I also think that the other problematic that I'd like to highlight is that, of course, this is only taking us back to 1913. It doesn't take us back to 1652. So there are some fundamental errors or flaws, I would say, in the underpinning of the Land Expropriation Act as it now is. But I do think in terms of reining in, the DA, or at the time the Democratic Party, were already reined in 1994. This act only gives voice to the modalities, Sakina, and the viewers of what a land expropriation would look like. It basically re-articulates it, and I think it's been, it's already been said, whether it's in the public interest, the public good, and so on, whether it is to build new hospitals, whether it's to build new social infrastructure, whether to build housing, and so on. And one of the things I think that is lacking in this particular act is that it doesn't speak enough about, the relationship between people and housing. It is very market orientated. It is very it is very market driven, and it is still very much concerned with the compromises. It is steeped in the compromises that were made in 1994, which were very much at the behest of the World Bank at the time. So I don't think that there's anything in particular to rein in, because this legislation is not particularly cutting edge, if one is fair. It actually speaks to really trying to formalize and to canonize what the pieces of legislation and the endeavors that have been sort of lying around, as it were, for many, many years. Partly to say that, of course, one can't help but think that much of this is, the ANC has not per se historically had a strong view on land. That has been the purview of the further Black conscious Africanist tradition, bits of which newer parties like the EFF have picked up on and popularized, but it is by no means a new position. So indeed, I don't think that the Democratic Alliance per se is being reined in, because all of these debates and all of this legislation has existed. This is just but one piece on top of many existing pieces of the architecture of what should be a land redistribution, a very slow land redistribution and land reparational process over the last 30 years.
Which, of course, makes interesting the remarks by the U.S. president around this particular matter, pronouncing, of course, that he would stop all funding to South Africa as a result of this, among other problematic issues that he speaks about, certain people being treated very badly in this country, etc. So you listen to that sort of rhetoric by the US president, you look at what's happening in the DRC, and suddenly some of the international issues that the president would perhaps have traditionally placed at the end of his speech that have suddenly taken center stage, and this is what we are talking about as a nation. But how do you juxtapose that with our own needs still as a country that still is struggling to create employment for the majority of people, a country that is still, struggling with redress issues from our past, a country where we're still battling inequality that some would say is directly tied into the land question. So we still have a lot to do and a long way to go, but where should the balancing act be?
So, when you speak about the need for land redistribution and the need, and tying that in with poverty, and this whole notion of, the kind of the fake news that President Trump seems to be, quite bombastic, propagandistic fake news that he seems to be quite, pithy, quite akin to promote, which is incredibly regrettable, in fact, is to also remember that none of this is new. So remember that we already had the RDP, and one of the aims of the RDP was to distribute 30% of agricultural land by 1999, Sakina. So it isn't as though the US is jumping on top of something that is bright and shiny and new. I think it's only because of, as I say, this particular iteration has been visibilized. And I think second to that is that when we think around things like the extension of Tenure and Labor Tenants Act, which also were part of the labor and redistribute, and trying to equalize and to bring equilibrium to relationships between tenants and farm workers in this country, understanding that tenants or farm workers have been incredibly marginalized and excluded. It would really behove President Trump it would behove him to really rethink and to do a bit more research about who is actually being dispossessed within these and marginalized within the labor relations of land workers in this country since 1994, and of course for many hundreds of years before that, which is why we still have the extension of the ESTA Act, which was supposed extension of Security of Tenure Act, which was supposed to ensure that farm workers who die on property, it would ensure that then their families, their descendants would not be dispossessed, would not be displaced. And we have seen the most egregious, the most atrocious treatment of African people and African farm workers in this country. So I think if his attention is going to be turned to labor relations and farm relations, I don't think that the colloquial white farmers, as it were, are really the victims in this scenario. But when you ask as well about the other problems that we are facing, Sakina, and that perhaps in the context of all of this, to then extend greater expenditure as part of the SADC peacekeeping forces to go and fight battles and to keep peace in places that perhaps seem rather remote. Remember that we do have obligations as the SADC. We do have peacekeeping forces. We do also have an obligation, of course, even though we speak about, the SADC speaks about non-interference, but of course there are obligations to try to provide solidarity support where it is called for. One can then, of course, ask why, if there isn't any real recession and any real resistance in hostilities, and whether or not this has actually been effective in the DRC. And I think that's a complex story for another day. And of course, we heard about the deaths of several soldiers, SADC soldiers, not only South African soldiers, but soldiers from Malawi, Zimbabwe, and so on over the last few weeks. Again, this has been happening, but for whatever reason, at this precise moment, it has been particularly visibilized. I think that there is a strong and compelling case to say that it might be useful to rethink what our foreign international relations strategy would be in this moment, without, of course, abrogating and without, of course, reneging on our responsibilities as a very strong SADC partner. But of course, we're also aware that when one is sitting in Kaelicha, is sitting in Tembisa, is sitting in Lusikisiki, and watching these huge billions of rands annually going to wars that many of us don't have any real understanding of, it can seem incredibly frustrating. And I think that this is a frustration that I hope President Ramaphosa can name and begin to distinguish within his State of the Nation address this coming week.
And also, I guess for many of those South Africans that you mentioned, for pensioners, for example, for those dependent on social grants who are unemployed, they are sitting and watching, particularly waiting to hear from the president how they will be assisted. So we heard about the basic income grant, for example, and I remember asking the then Minister of Social Development, Lindiwe Zulu, I think it was last year, and that was at the State of the Nation address in February, and I asked her about the basic income grant, and she said at the time that it was a matter of time. It was simply about figuring out the modalities around this particular matter. So what has happened to the basic income grant? And given that we now have a government of national unity, is this likely to materialize?
Yeah, I mean, you ask an important question, especially when recent reports state that at least 20%, 1 in 5 households in South Africa, are facing food insecurity. About 18 million people, adults in this country, live below the poverty levels. Now, there are several there are several institutions and formations led by think tanks like the Institute for Economic Justice, who have really been doing quite incredible work in this regard. And some of the things that come across that seemingly keep on being emerging are things like the means testing, who is and is not deserving. And I think that this notion of insufficient means is very important and incredibly intrusive, Sakina and the viewers, because it actually means that, for example, it takes into account inflows into applicants' bank accounts, including regular or irregular ad hoc payments, loans, and repayments. And I'm citing the Institute for Economic Justice in this regard. And I think that it's incredibly problematic to assume that people who are of a lower income level are not entitled to the same privacies as yourself or myself, Sakina. It also then uses a very outdated verification process. This relies on sometimes very, outdated government databases. And I think, we're aware that although there are some excellent civil servants and public servants, there are also some pockets of really, really poor performance. And this would be one of them, I would argue. There is also not a very good appeals process for where people feel that they're not able to show new evidence that compels them. That might be compelling enough to convince that perhaps they are entitled to this basic income grant. And I think that we should also rethink in general, Sakina and the viewers, the way that we perceive people who are living on the margins as being sponges, as feeling entitled, and so on. There are some very unfortunate and I think toxic poverty shaming dogmas, which seem to underpin a lot of our policy maker. This idea that a lot of people are just being lazy, that they don't want to work, and that those are those people. Very problematic, because many of those people are our people, our own neighbors, our own family members, in many regards, our own community members. And I do think that as still a predominantly African-led government, the ANC still being the single largest part of the GNU, that kind of rhetoric should not play itself out in an African country where there's historical and systematic dispossession and marginalization of African people. Now, to your question, the GNU and their partners within, they too, I would really argue, Sakina, if they have any sense of social solidarity, need to appreciate that the majority of people in this country are African people, and that it is those people that this is really part, that the basic income grant and other forms of social rescue and the social wage, as you say, are part of a redistributional process. They are part of a process of bringing people into the market economy to move them away from absolute dire poverty, grinding poverty, to enable them to participate with dignity in the market economy rather than standing at the robots begging for 5 cents every day.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully we can catch up after SONA. That was Lebohang Pheko, who's a senior research fellow at Trade Collective, just previewing President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address for us.